Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1885 brought more than just snow to New Haven, Connecticut. As temperatures dropped and the harbor began to freeze, the town prepared for the usual quiet months that characterized New England winters. Most businesses reduced their hours. The oyster boats were pulled ashore, and families settled in for the season of long nights. None could have anticipated that this particular winter would mark their town in medical annals for generations to come, or that the arrival of a seemingly ordinary traveling show would initiate a scientific mystery that remains unresolved to this day. On December 14th, a modest caravan of 7 wagons made its way down Chapel Street, the wooden wheels clattering against the cobblestones. The lead wagon displayed a weathered banner, "Hargrove's Spectacular Curiosities." This was not one of the grand circuses like Barnum's or the Ringling Brothers, but rather one of dozens of smaller shows that traversed the rural routes of America, bringing entertainment to communities too small to attract the famous troops. According to town records, Jonathan Hargrove had filed the appropriate permits for a 3-day engagement, setting up on the vacant lot behind Miller's Hardware. The New Haven Register mentioned the arrival with just 2 sentences. "Hargrove's Circus has established its tents on the Miller property. Performances daily at 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. through Wednesday." Such brief notices were common for traveling shows, which rarely merited extensive coverage unless they featured particularly renowned acts. What made this otherwise unremarkable circus significant was a single performer, billed on the handbills that were posted around town as the Enigma of New England, a woman who, according to the promotional materials, possessed physiological traits that defy the understanding of modern medicine. Such extravagant claims were standard fare for circus promotions of the era. What distinguished this case was that the extraordinary claim would eventually attract serious scientific scrutiny. The woman's name was Eliza Corbin. According to the circus roster filed with the town clerk, a requirement for all traveling shows, primarily for tax purposes, she was 30 years old and had been with Hargrove's company for approximately 6 years. The document listed her previous employment simply as domestic service, a common occupation for unmarried women of that period. Nothing in these official records hinted at anything unusual. The first performance on December 14th drew a modest crowd, typical for a Monday. The show proceeded without incident, featuring the standard offerings of such traveling entertainments: a horseback rider performing simple tricks, a trained dog act, a strong man lifting various weights, and a palm reader offering glimpses into the future for an additional fee. The sideshow portion, where human curiosities were exhibited, included a bearded woman, a remarkably tall man billed as the Massachusetts Giant, and Eliza Corbin, whose act came last. According to accounts later collected by researchers, the audience's reaction to Eliza's performance was notably different from the polite applause that greeted the other acts. One spectator, Mary Whitfield, wrote in her diary that evening, "The circus was much as expected until the final performer. The woman they called the Enigma performed something so peculiar that Mr. Whitfield insisted we leave before its conclusion. Several other families departed with us. I confess I cannot adequately describe what I glimpsed, except to say it left me feeling deeply unsettled, as though witnessing something unnatural." The Connecticut Daily Chronicle, in its December 16th edition, reported a considerable crowd gathered at Hargrove's evening showcase, drawn primarily by rumors of the unusual woman said to possess extraordinary physical adaptations. The article continues, "Attendees departed with expressions of both wonder and disquiet. Several patrons were overheard remarking that the final exhibition was unlike anything previously witnessed and disturbing to natural sensibilities. The newspaper's restraint is notable, making no specific claims about what was observed, only documenting the audience reaction. Present at this performance was Dr. Harrison Wells, a physician with an established practice in New Haven and faculty connections to Yale Medical School. Wells, then 46, specialized in anatomical studies and had published several papers on muscle diseases. His presence at a traveling circus was unusual for a man of his standing, but would later be explained in his correspondence. A colleague in Boston had written to him about rumors of a circus performer with physiological anomalies that might merit scientific observation. What Wells witnessed that evening would consume his professional attention for years to come. His initial reaction is preserved in a letter to Dr. James Pritchard of Hartford, dated December 15, 1885. I attended the exhibition with the full expectation of observing the usual anatomical quirks that these traveling shows exploit, individuals with congenital abnormalities or those skilled in contortion. What I witnessed, however, has left me professionally disturbed. The subject demonstrates physiological characteristics that bear no resemblance to any documented medical condition. I am reluctant to detail my observations until I have conducted a proper examination, lest you dismiss my account as fanciful. The letter continues, I have arranged to meet with the proprietor tomorrow morning to request a private examination of the subject. Should he consent, I will document my findings with scientific rigor. If my initial observations prove accurate, we may be confronting a medical anomaly of significant importance. Dr. Wells' appointment book, preserved in the Yale archives, contains an entry for December 16th, simply noting, Examination of circus subject, Hargroves, 10 a.m. No further details appear in this public record. What transpired during that examination is documented in two distinctly different accounts. Jonathan Hargrove, when later questioned by local authorities investigating Wells's subsequent behavior, stated, The doctor spent less than 15 minutes with Miss Corbin, appeared visibly shaken, and departed without comment. He left his medical bag behind, which I found most peculiar for a professional gentleman. When my assistant returned it to his office that afternoon, his housekeeper reported he had not been seen since the morning appointment. Wells' account, detailed in a 9-page report that he shared only with 2 trusted colleagues, presents a significantly different narrative. This report, sealed in Yale's restricted archives until being discovered in 1962, provides the most detailed, first-hand description of Eliza Corbin's condition. According to Wells, the examination took place in a rented room above Mason's Apothecary on Chapel Street, a location Hargrove had secured to provide privacy. Wells writes that Eliza Corbin was a woman of unremarkable appearance, approximately 5 feet 4 inches in height, with brown hair and eyes. Her manner is reserved but articulate, displaying none of the theatrical affectations common to performers. Physical examination reveals no observable abnormalities when at rest. Wells recorded that Eliza claimed to have been born in a farming community in western Massachusetts, but was reluctant to provide specific details about her early life. She described her unusual ability as having manifested around the age of 15, initially causing her great distress, until she encountered a traveling showman who recognized the potential commercial value of her condition. What follows in Wells' account represents the first medical documentation of Eliza's condition. Upon request, and with apparent concentration, the subject demonstrated an ability to alter the density and, seemingly, the very structure of her muscular tissues. The transformation begins at the extremities and progresses centrally. The effect is not an illusion of lighting or perspective, but a genuine alteration of physical properties that defies current medical understanding. Wells described taking basic measurements of her arm circumference before and during the demonstration, recording a reduction of nearly 2 inches despite no visible change in volume. He noted that her skin temperature remained constant, her pulse steady at 72 beats per minute, and her breathing controlled throughout the demonstration. The subject exhibits no signs of discomfort during the transformation, though she reports that maintaining the altered state requires intense concentration and cannot be sustained indefinitely. The maximum duration observed was approximately 3 minutes, after which the tissues gradually returned to their normal state. Most significantly, Wells reported attempting to palpate the affected tissues during the transformation. Upon applying pressure to the subject's forearm during the demonstration, I encountered a sensation entirely unfamiliar in my medical experience. The tissue yielded in a manner suggesting altered density rather than elasticity, creating an impression best described as passing one's fingers through partially solidified gelatin. This physical sensation was so unexpected that I involuntarily withdrew my hand. According to Wells, Eliza explained that she had first noticed this ability during adolescence. "It simply began one day," she reportedly told him. "At first I thought I was unwell, that my perception was distorted. It was only when others reacted that I understood something was happening that was visible to all." Wells concluded his report with remarkable candor. "I find myself unable to offer any scientific explanation for what I have observed. The subject does not appear to be perpetrating deception, nor does she seem to be suffering from any recognizable pathology. I have considered all possibilities of trickery, including strategic muscle contraction, optical illusion, or hypnotic suggestion, and find none of these explanations satisfactory. I am left with the deeply uncomfortable position of having observed something that exists outside our current medical framework." The report indicates that Wells asked Eliza if she had ever been examined by other physicians. She reportedly told him that 2 doctors in Philadelphia had briefly observed her 3 years earlier, but had dismissed her condition as theatrical deception after a cursory examination. Wells noted, "The subject expressed reluctance regarding further medical scrutiny, stating that her previous experiences with physicians had been unsatisfactory and occasionally degrading. She consented to this examination only after considerable persuasion from Mr. Hargrove, apparently motivated by the additional compensation I provided." Following this initial examination, Wells immediately contacted 2 colleagues he believed would approach the case with appropriate scientific rigor: Dr. James Pritchard of Hartford Hospital, a specialist in nervous disorders, and Dr. Frederick Simmons from the Massachusetts Medical Society, who had published several papers on unusual anatomical variations. His telegrams to both men, preserved in the Yale archives, were nearly identical. "Have observed medical anomaly of significant interest. Stop request your presence in New Haven for examination. Stop most urgent stop." Both physicians responded affirmatively, and Wells scheduled a second examination for December 18th, 2 days later. He arranged to pay Hargrove a substantial fee of $50, equivalent to approximately $1,500 in today's currency, for exclusive access to Eliza before the Circus's departure. On the morning of December 18th, however, Wells arrived at the Circus grounds to discover the entire company had departed overnight, a full day ahead of their scheduled conclusion. A boy selling newspapers informed him that the wagons had been seen leaving town shortly after midnight, traveling north on the Boston Post Road. The New Haven Register noted the departure briefly. "Hargrove's company has moved on earlier than announced, citing scheduling demands in Bridgeport." This was not entirely unusual for traveling shows, which sometimes altered their routes based on weather conditions or competing entertainments. Wells, however, was reportedly furious. A telegram he sent to the proprietor of the Imperial Hotel in Bridgeport reads, "Strongly protest your departure. Stop scientific importance. Paramount. Stop. Will compensate generously for return. Stop await your response at Western Union office. Stop." There is no record of Hargrove's response in the archives. What followed was an increasingly desperate pursuit that would consume the next 3 years of Dr. Wells's life, all documented in his journals and correspondence. He tracked Hargrove's spectacular curiosities through Connecticut and into New York State, always arriving days after they had moved on. His journal entries during this period reveal an increasing obsession. December 24, 1885. Christmas Eve finds me in Danbury, where Hargrove's company performed 3 days ago. The hotel keeper recalls a quiet woman who took meals alone, but can provide no information on their next destination. I have canceled my holiday engagements and informed Emily, his wife, that professional obligations require my absence. She expressed concern about my health, noting I appear haunted, perhaps an accurate assessment, though not in the spectral sense, she implies. December 29, 1885. I cannot relinquish this inquiry. What I witnessed represents either a profound medical discovery or an elaborate deception of unprecedented sophistication. Either possibility demands resolution. My practice suffers from neglect, but some pursuits transcend ordinary professional obligations. January 3, 1886. Traced the circus to Poughkeepsie through advertisements in local papers. Again, too late. A stable hand informs me they departed for Albany 2 days ago. The winter weather makes travel arduous, but I persevere. I find myself wondering about the woman herself, not merely her condition, but what manner of life she leads, traveling with these carnival people, herself a living exhibit. By January 7th, Wells had traced the circus to Albany, only to discover they had disbanded. The proprietor of the Excelsior Hotel informed him that Jonathan Hargrove had sold most of the equipment and animals, paid his performers, and departed. The performers had scattered, some joining other shows, others returning to their homes. The Albany Evening Journal of January 5th carried a small item noting that Hargrove's Circus, which performed to modest crowds on New Year's weekend, has disbanded, with Mr. Hargrove reportedly departing for Chicago to address family matters. Whether this was true remains unconfirmed. Eliza Corbin had vanished. Wells returned to New Haven and his medical practice, but his correspondence indicates he had not abandoned his search. Over the next 3 years, he wrote to colleagues in major cities across the country, placed advertisements in theatrical newspapers such as the New York Clipper, and even hired a Pinkerton detective briefly in 1887 to trace Eliza's whereabouts. His letters from this period show a man increasingly isolated in his pursuit. In March 1886, a colleague from Boston wrote, "My dear Harrison, while I do not doubt the sincerity of your observations, I must express concern regarding the extent to which this matter has consumed you. A single unexplained case, however perplexing, must be weighed against your established practice and reputation. I urge a return to your usual scientific inquiries." Wells responded, "I appreciate your concern, but you did not witness what I observed. If this phenomenon is genuine, and I can conceive of no trickery that could replicate it, then our understanding of human physiology requires significant revision. I cannot in good conscience abandon this investigation." His wife's concerns are evident in a letter she wrote to her sister in April 1887. Harrison remains fixated on this circus woman. He maintains his practice, but his mind is often elsewhere. He has converted the small study into what he calls his research room, filled with journals and correspondence related to his search. I have suggested a holiday in Newport this summer, hoping to restore his spirits, but he insists he cannot leave New Haven in case word arrives. In September 1887, Wells received a potential lead from a physician in Chicago who wrote that a patient had mentioned seeing a remarkable woman in a small exhibition in St. Louis who could change the very nature of her flesh. Wells immediately traveled to St. Louis, only to discover the performer in question was practicing a well-known illusion involving selective muscle contraction. In his journal he wrote, "Another disappointment. This marks the 7th false lead I have pursued. My colleagues increasingly regard my search with skepticism, if not outright concern for my mental well-being. Yet I cannot forget what I felt beneath my fingers, tissue transforming in a manner that violated every principle of anatomy I have studied. I am not a fanciful man, nor given to exaggeration. What I experienced was real. Then, in October 1889, nearly 4 years after his initial examination, Wells received a letter postmarked from San Francisco. The letter, preserved in the Yale collection, is written in a neat, feminine hand. Dr. Wells, I understand you have been searching for me these past years. Your persistence is remarkable, though I must confess it has necessitated greater caution on my part than I would have preferred. I write not to invite further examination, but to offer you peace of mind. What you observed is real. I am neither charlatan nor illusion. However, there are aspects of nature that perhaps are not meant to be dissected and classified. I have found a quiet life here, away from curious eyes and probing instruments. I ask that you respect my desire for privacy, know that your observations were correct, your faculties sound. Sometimes that confirmation must be enough. E.C. The letter provides no return address, no indication of her precise whereabouts in San Francisco, a city of some 300,000 people at that time. Wells' response to this communication is recorded in his journal. Received correspondence from E.C. Itwi, today. After these years of searching to receive confirmation of her existence, and more importantly, of my sanity, brings a complex mixture of relief and frustration. She offers no opportunity for further scientific inquiry, yet provides the validation I have sought. I find myself unsure how to proceed. Whether Wells honored this request for privacy is unclear. His journal entries following receipt of the letter become notably sparse and more focused on his regular medical practice. He mentions Eliza only once more, in an entry dated February 1890. Received word from the West today that suggests E.C. has relocated again, possibly to Sacramento. I find I no longer have the will to continue the pursuit. Some mysteries, perhaps, are better left as such. I have instructed Pinkerton to cease their inquiries. For the remaining years of his life, Wells returned to his conventional medical practice and research. His publications from 1890 until his death in 1901 focus on respiratory diseases and anatomical variations of the circulatory system, with no mention of his encounter with Eliza Corbin. His colleagues noted a change in his demeanor, as described in a letter from Dr. Pritchard in 1893. Harrison seems to have returned fully to his former self. The obsession that concerned us all appears to have dissipated entirely. When I inquired obliquely about the circus woman during our last meeting, he merely smiled and changed the subject. Harrison Wells died of pneumonia in February 1901 at the age of 61. His obituary in the New Haven Register described him as a respected physician of traditional practice and sound judgment, noting his contributions to the understanding of pulmonary diseases and his service during a typhoid outbreak in 1896. No mention was made of his pursuit of Eliza Corbin or his documentation of her unusual condition. Following his death, his papers, including his notes on Eliza Corbin, were donated to Yale by his widow. A letter accompanying the donation indicates she was unaware of their significance. I provide these documents to the university where my husband taught, believing they may contain information of value to medical students. I have not reviewed them in detail, as much of the technical content exceeds my understanding. The materials were cataloged as part of the university's medical archives, most containing routine medical observations and correspondence related to his general practice. The Eliza Corbin documents, including his detailed examination notes and subsequent correspondence, were filed with miscellaneous case studies, unmarked by any special designation that might have drawn attention to their unusual content. And so the story of Eliza Corbin faded from memory, the documents gathering dust in Yale's archives for decades, known only to the archivists who periodically reorganized the collections. The woman with the inexplicable ability became, at most, an anecdote occasionally shared among older physicians, usually dismissed as a case of professional delusion or an elaborate hoax. The story might have ended there, forgotten entirely, if not for Margaret Holloway. In 1962, Holloway was a graduate student at Yale, researching 19th-century entertainment for her doctoral dissertation on medical perspectives on popular entertainment, 1850-1900. Her focus was primarily on how physicians of that era viewed performers who subjected their bodies to extreme conditions, contortionists, fire eaters, sword swallowers, and the like. While examining the archived papers of physicians who had documented such performances, Holloway came across Wells's sealed report on Eliza Corbin. The document was contained in an envelope marked simply Confidential Observations, H. Wells, 18B5, filed among papers related to anatomical anomalies. In a recorded interview conducted in 1967, Holloway described her initial reaction. "I expected another clinical assessment of a contortionist or someone with a congenital condition. What I found instead was this meticulous documentation of something that shouldn't be possible." Wells wasn't some credulous provincial doctor. He had publications in respected medical journals. His description was detailed, clinical, and yet described something that defied explanation. Intrigued, Holloway expanded her research beyond her original dissertation topic. She traced newspaper accounts of Hargrove's Circus, located surviving playbills in regional historical societies, and began searching for additional witnesses to Eliza's performances. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a letter to the editor of the Hartford Courant from January 1886, signed only "A Concerned Citizen," which described the writer's experience at Hargrove's show. What I observed was not the crude trickery one expects from these traveling exhibitions, but something that left many in the audience visibly unsettled. The woman's transformation seemed to defy natural law, yet occurred before our very eyes. I am a person of education, and not given to fanciful interpretations, yet I cannot reconcile what I witnessed with the known principles of anatomy. Through persistent research, Holloway uncovered several additional first-hand accounts. The Journal of Rebecca Tillman, a school teacher who attended the New Haven performance, contained an entry from December 15, 1885. "Attended the circus this evening with Jane. Most was the usual affair, but the woman they call the Enigma has left me troubled. When she began to change, Jane clutched my arm with such force that I found bruises this morning. There is something profoundly disquieting about witnessing something one knows should not be possible." We spoke little on the walk home, both lost in our thoughts. Jane finally said, "I wish we had not seen that," and I could only agree. Another account came from Arthur Fleming, then a medical student at Yale, who wrote in a letter to his parents dated December 17, 1885, "Last night several of us attended the traveling circus, expecting an evening of amusement. The final act, however, has left us in scholarly debate. A woman demonstrated a physiological feat that our anatomy professor insists must be trickery, yet none of us can propose a mechanism by which it could be falsified. Simmons suggested some form of hypnotic suggestion affecting our perception, but this seems inadequate to explain the collective experience." Holloway also discovered that Eliza Corbin was not the woman's birth name. Parish records from Sheffield, Massachusetts, indicated that Elizabeth Catherine Marsh was born there in 1855 to Thomas and Mary Marsh, farmers of modest means. School records described her as a child of unusual solemnity, though not lacking in intelligence. Elizabeth disappeared from local records around 1870, at approximately age 15, coinciding with the death of her mother from tuberculosis. The connection between Elizabeth Marsh and Eliza Corbin was established through a remarkable coincidence. Among Dr. Wells's papers was a sketch he had made of Eliza during his examination. When Holloway published this image in her preliminary research paper, she received a letter from an elderly woman in Sheffield who recognized the face as that of the Marsh girl who ran away, and provided family details that matched the parish records. According to this correspondent, identified as Mrs. Eleanor Wilson, who had been a childhood acquaintance of Elizabeth, the Marsh girl was always different, even before she ran away. Not in any way you could name precisely. She was quiet, watchful. The other children found her strange and kept their distance. There were rumors, after she disappeared, that she had shown something unusual to the blacksmith's boy, who refused to speak of it afterward. Most assumed it was something improper, but perhaps it was something else entirely. Her father never spoke of her after she left, acted as though she had never existed. What happened to Eliza after her letter to Dr. Wells in 1889 required further investigation. Through painstaking research of public records, Holloway found a marriage certificate in Sacramento from 1891 for an Eliza C. Marsh to William Donovan, a railroad engineer. The couple appears in the 1900 census, living in Oakland, California, with William listed as Engineer Southern Pacific Railroad and Eliza as homemaker. They had no children. A death certificate for Eliza Donovan, aged 68, was filed in Alameda County, California in 1923. The cause of death is listed as heart failure, a common catch-all diagnosis of the era. There is no mention of any unusual physical conditions or circumstances surrounding her death. Holloway's most significant discovery came from the archives of the Oakland Tribune. In a local notices column from February 1923, a brief item appeared. Funeral services for Mrs. Eliza Donovan, longtime resident, were held yesterday at Lakeside Presbyterian. Mrs. Donovan, widow of Southern Pacific engineer William Donovan, was known in the community for her extensive charitable work with the Ladies' Aid Society and her exceptional skill in textile arts. Her intricate needlework was displayed at the California State Fair in 1915, winning recognition for its unique patterns and textures. The reference to exceptional skill in textile arts and unique patterns and textures struck Holloway as potentially significant. In a 1967 interview, she speculated, "It seems possible that Eliza found a way to channel her unusual ability into a socially acceptable form." The description of her needlework as having unique textures suggests she may have been able to manipulate materials in ways others could not. It would have allowed her to use her gift without drawing the kind of attention that had previously made her a spectacle. Dr. Margaret Holloway attempted to locate any surviving examples of Eliza's textile work, contacting historical societies in Oakland and the organizers of the California State Fair, but found no preserved samples or detailed descriptions. She also sought any living relatives of the Donovans, but found no descendants. William Donovan had died in 1919 of complications from influenza, and the couple had no children. Property records indicate their modest home in Oakland was sold shortly after Eliza's death, the proceeds going to the Lakeside Presbyterian Church. Holloway's research culminated in a journal article titled "The Enigma of New England, Scientific Mystery or Elaborate Hoax," published in the Yale Journal of Medical History in 1963. The article presented the evidence she had gathered without sensationalism, acknowledging the limitations of historical research while raising important questions about how the medical establishment responds to phenomena that challenge existing paradigms. The article attracted little attention outside academic circles when published. Holloway had approached the subject with scholarly caution, presenting the evidence without making extraordinary claims and suggesting that while Eliza Corbin Marsh's condition remained unexplained, it likely represented either an elaborate deception that fooled even medical professionals or potentially a unique physiological anomaly that might have illuminated aspects of human anatomy had it been properly studied. In a follow-up paper published in 1965, Holloway proposed several possible medical explanations based on conditions known at that time, including various forms of connective tissue disorders or unusual control over muscle fasciculation, but acknowledged that none fully explained the phenomena described by multiple witnesses. One section of this paper addresses the psychological aspects of the case. We must consider not only what Eliza Corbin could do, but how her unusual ability shaped her life. The records suggest a woman who fled from her rural origins, possibly due to negative reactions to her condition, who found temporary sanctuary in the circus world where physiological uniqueness had commercial value, and who ultimately sought anonymity in a conventional life. The psychological burden of possessing abilities that invite both exploitation and fear must have been considerable. Dr. Holloway completed her dissertation in 1964 and accepted a teaching position at Columbia University. She continued to research unusual medical cases of the 19th century, but never found another case comparable to Eliza's. In a personal letter to a colleague in 1968, she wrote, "The Corbin case continues to fascinate me, though I've accepted I may never find a satisfactory explanation. What troubles me most is not the possibility that she possessed some unique physiological trait, but rather that such a potentially important medical anomaly could simply vanish from scientific inquiry, lost to time and circumstance." The documents relating to Eliza Corbin remained in Yale's archives, occasionally referenced by medical historians, but largely forgotten by the wider world. In 1968, when the medical school reorganized its historical collections, the Wells papers were cataloged and microfilmed, but filed under 19th century medical practices, general, rather than given a dedicated classification. Then, in April 1968, an unusual incident occurred. A fire broke out in the storage facility where many of the original documents were kept. While the fire was contained quickly and most materials were saved, several collections sustained water damage from the sprinkler system. Among these were the original Wells papers, including his examination notes on Eliza Corbin and the sketch he had made of her. The university's report on the incident notes that materials related to 19th century medical practices suffered moderate water damage. Affected documents have been removed for preservation treatment. While the microfilm copies remained intact, some details from the original documents, particularly Wells's sketches of Eliza, lost clarity in the reproduction process. Dr. Holloway, upon learning of the damage, traveled to New Haven to assess the condition of the materials related to her research. In a letter to the university archivist dated May 12, 1968, she expressed concern. "While I understand the necessary preservation procedures, I am troubled by the potential loss of detail in the Wells sketches, which represent the only known visual documentation of the subject's condition. Particularly concerning is the possible degradation of his detailed annotations regarding tissue changes and the precise sequence of the transformation he observed." The archivist's response, dated May 20th, was brief and formal. "Preservation efforts continue on the water-damaged materials. We regret any inconvenience to researchers, but access to the original documents must remain restricted until conservation work is completed." No further correspondence between Holloway and the Yale archives exists in the public record. Conservation efforts were reportedly completed by late 1968, but by then Holloway had moved on to other research projects. Her curriculum vitae from Columbia University shows that her publications after 1968 focused on more conventional topics in medical history, particularly the development of obstetrical practices and the role of women physicians in the late 19th century. The story of Eliza Corbin might have remained buried in academic archives indefinitely, if not for one final coincidence. In 1969, Dr. Richard Ambrose, a neurologist at the University of California, San Francisco, was researching rare neuromuscular conditions when he encountered Holloway's 1963 article. Ambrose became intrigued by the description of Eliza's condition and began corresponding with Holloway. In his letters, preserved in Holloway's papers at Columbia, he suggested that Eliza may have had a previously undocumented form of voluntary control over typically involuntary muscle functions, potentially related to extreme cases of body temperature regulation seen in certain meditation practitioners. Ambrose proposed a modern medical explanation. What witnesses described as changes in density might represent an unusual form of localized muscle control, perhaps involving simultaneous contraction of antagonistic muscle groups, creating an appearance of structural change while actually demonstrating extraordinary neurological control. He continued, "The sensation Dr. What Wells described when touching her arm during the transformation, like partially solidified gelatin, could potentially be explained by a combination of selective blood vessel constriction and precise control over fascial tension. Such control would be unprecedented, but not theoretically impossible within human physiological parameters." Holloway's response was measured. "Your hypothesis is certainly more plausible than anything I've developed. However, it doesn't fully account for Dr. Wells's observation that the very structure of the tissues appeared altered, nor the consistent reports from multiple witnesses of visible transformation that left them deeply unsettled. These accounts suggest something beyond even extraordinary muscle control." Ambrose then proposed a research project to identify individuals with unusual levels of voluntary control over normally autonomic functions, suggesting that Eliza Corbin may represent an extreme example of capabilities that exist on a spectrum within the general population. He sought Holloway's assistance in securing funding for such research. However, in his last letter to Holloway, dated September 1969, Ambrose wrote, "I regret to inform you that my proposal for research into extreme cases of neuromuscular control has been rejected by the grant committee. The feedback suggests the project was considered too speculative and lacking in preliminary data. I've concluded that without the subject herself to examine, we can never move beyond speculation." The case reminds us that medical science, for all its advances, occasionally encounters phenomena that resist classification. Perhaps the most valuable aspect of the Corbin case is not what it reveals about unusual physiology, but what it teaches us about the limits of observation and the persistence of mystery even in scientific inquiry. No further correspondence between Holloway and Ambrose exists in the archives. Dr. Holloway continued her academic career at Columbia until her retirement in 1981, producing several respected works on medical history, but never returning to the Eliza Corbin case in her published research. She died in 1984 after a brief illness, her papers donated to Columbia University's archives. Dr. Ambrose continued his neurological research until his retirement in 1987, making significant contributions to the understanding of neuromuscular disorders, particularly in the field of muscular dystrophy. He never published anything related to the Eliza Corbin case, though colleagues recalled him occasionally mentioning the Circus woman case as an example of the limitations of medical knowledge. The microfilm documents at Yale remain accessible to researchers, though rarely requested. The original materials following preservation treatment after the 1968 water damage were placed in climate-controlled storage, categorized simply as 19th century medical observations, miscellaneous. In 1992, during the digitization of selected historical medical records at Yale, a graduate assistant named Thomas Chen came across the Wells-Corbin documents. Intrigued, he brought them to the attention of his supervisor, Dr. Eleanor Prentice, a medical historian specializing in 19th century practice. Dr. Prentice reviewed the materials and subsequently conducted a limited investigation into the case. Her notes, contained in the Prentice papers at Yale, indicate she contacted several specialists in rare physiological conditions seeking modern explanations for what Wells had observed. The responses universally suggested that the described phenomena exceeded known physiological capabilities. In a draft paper that was never published, Prentice wrote, "The Corbin case presents an epistemological challenge to medical history. We have detailed documentation from a credible physician, corroborating accounts from multiple witnesses, and no evidence of deliberate deception. Yet the described phenomena exceed our current understanding of human physiology. We are left with an unsolvable equation. Either multiple observers were somehow collectively deceived, or there existed in the late 19th century a woman whose physiological capabilities remain unexplained by modern science." Dr. Prentice ultimately decided against publishing her analysis, noting in a memo to the department chair, "While academically fascinating, the Corbin case lacks sufficient documentation by contemporary standards to merit formal publication. The original records have deteriorated, no medical photographs exist, and the phenomenon was never observed under controlled laboratory conditions. Publishing would likely invite skepticism rather than scholarly interest." The case returned to obscurity until 2003, when Dr. Michael Reeves, a biophysicist at Johns Hopkins University, encountered references to Eliza Corbin while researching historical cases of unusual tissue elasticity. His interest piqued. Reeves traveled to Yale to examine the microfilmed records personally. In his research notes, Reeves observed, "Wells's description suggests a level of voluntary control over connective tissue that exceeds anything in the medical literature. If accurate, Eliza Corbin could manipulate the collagen structure of her tissues in ways that even modern tissue engineering cannot replicate." The most intriguing aspect is Wells's description of the tactile sensation, not merely softened tissue, but a fundamental change in material properties. Reeves consulted with Dr. Anita Sharma, a specialist in connective tissue disorders at Mayo Clinic. Dr. Sharma's assessment, contained in an email exchange preserved in Reeves's files, was skeptical but not dismissive. The described phenomena exceed known pathologies. Ehlers-Danlos and related disorders involve tissue elasticity, but not the kind of density changes you describe. If this historical case is accurately reported, it represents either an undocumented, extreme variation of a known condition or something entirely novel. Reeves attempted to secure funding for a research project to identify individuals with unusual levels of connective tissue control, explicitly citing the Corbin case as historical precedent. Grant reviewers described the proposal as speculative and based on anecdotal historical evidence of questionable reliability. In a 2005 article published in the Journal of Biophysical Medicine, Reeves included a brief reference to the Corbin case in a broader discussion of tissue plasticity, describing it as a provocative historical case suggesting the potential for voluntary control over tissue properties that exceeds current physiological models. This single paragraph represents the only mention of Eliza Corbin in modern scientific literature. Like Ambrose before him, he found the scientific community unreceptive. Dr. Reeves continued his research in tissue biomechanics until his death in 2012, never returning to the Corbin case in his published work. In an interview for a university publication in 2010, however, he mentioned the case when asked about unexplained phenomena in his field. There are historical cases that hint at capabilities beyond our current understanding. A 19th century physician documented a woman who could apparently alter her tissue properties voluntarily. We dismiss such accounts at our peril. The history of science is full of phenomena that were observed long before they could be explained. Today, the documents relating to Eliza Corbin remain in Yale's archives, accessible but rarely accessed. The original papers, damaged by water and time, have continued to deteriorate despite preservation efforts. The microfilm copies preserve the text, but lack the clarity of the original sketches and annotations. In 2017, during a conference on medical anomalies at Columbia University, Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a neurophysiologist, included a brief mention of the Corbin case in her presentation on unexplained physiological phenomena. Her reference was largely dismissive. Historical medical literature contains numerous accounts of supposedly extraordinary physiological capabilities that, upon examination, prove to be either misinterpretations or deliberate deceptions. The 1885 Corbin case, while detailed, likely represents a skilled performer's ability to create the illusion of tissue transformation through techniques similar to those employed by modern practitioners of muscle control. This characterization prompted a response from Dr. James Harrington, a medical historian present at the conference, who pointed out that multiple witnesses, including a respected physician who conducted a physical examination, had documented phenomena that exceeded simple muscle control. The brief exchange did not result in renewed interest in the case among the scientific community. What are we to make of Eliza Corbin? Was she, as some have suggested, merely an exceptionally skilled performer who managed to deceive even medical professionals? Was she, as Dr. Wells believed, a case of unique physiology that might have advanced medical understanding had circumstances been different? Or was she, perhaps, something else entirely? A glimpse of human potential that science still cannot fully explain. The historical record provides no definitive answer. What remains are the documents, the testimonies, the fragments of a story that appears to have no scientific resolution. As Dr. Ambrose noted, perhaps the value lies not in solving the mystery, but in acknowledging that even in our most rigorous inquiries, some phenomena remain beyond our current understanding. In the quiet section of Oakland's Mountain View Cemetery, there is a modest headstone bearing the name Eliza C. Donovan, 1855-1923, alongside that of her husband, William. Nothing in this simple marker suggests the extraordinary puzzle she presented to medical science. To visitors, it appears to be just another grave among thousands, the final resting place of an ordinary woman who lived through the transition from the 19th to the 20th century. The inscription reads simply, "Beloved wife at peace." No mention of her unusual abilities, no hint of the scientific mystery she embodied. In death, as apparently in the later years of her life, Eliza found the anonymity she sought. What would modern medicine make of Eliza Corbin if she appeared today? With advanced imaging technologies, tissue analysis, and genetic testing, could we finally understand her extraordinary ability? Or would she, as in the 19th century, remain an anomaly, a case that defies classification? One of the few people to consider this question seriously was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geneticist at the University of California, Berkeley, who in 2015 published a speculative paper titled Theoretical Genetic Mechanisms for Extreme Tissue Plasticity. While not specifically referencing the Corbin case, Vasquez proposed that certain rare genetic variations might enable levels of voluntary control over connective tissue that far exceed normal human capabilities. Vasquez suggested that combinations of mutations affecting collagen production, proprioceptive feedback, and neurological control mechanisms could theoretically result in unprecedented levels of voluntary tissue modification. However, she noted that such genetic combinations would be exceedingly rare and might manifest only under specific developmental conditions. When interviewed for a science podcast in 2016 and specifically asked about historical cases like Eliza Corbin's, Vasquez responded cautiously. Historical accounts are difficult to evaluate scientifically. However, I would say that our understanding of human physiology continues to evolve. We occasionally encounter individuals with capabilities that seemed impossible a generation earlier. The limits of human physiological potential remain incompletely defined. Perhaps the most thoughtful assessment comes from Dr. Rob Holloway's unpublished notes found among her papers at Columbia. The Eliza Corbin case reminds us of the tension between observation and explanation that drives scientific progress. Wells observed something he could not explain. Rather than dismissing his observation because it lacked an explanation, we might consider that some explanations simply lie beyond our current framework. Science advances not only by explaining the observed, but sometimes by acknowledging that the observed exceeds our explanations. For those few researchers familiar with her case, Eliza Corbin represents what the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn might call an anomaly, an observation that doesn't fit within the prevailing paradigm. Such anomalies are typically ignored or dismissed until they accumulate in sufficient numbers to force a paradigm shift. Whether Eliza represents such an anomaly or merely a historical curiosity remains uncertain. What is clear is that her story challenges our assumptions about the limits of human physiology and reminds us that even in an age of scientific certainty, mysteries persist. The most recent scholarly mention of Eliza Corbin appears in a 2019 article by Dr. Rebecca Chen in the Journal of Medical Anomalies, titled Unexplained Physiological Phenomena in Historical Context. Chen writes, "The case of Eliza Corbin, while poorly documented by modern standards, represents an intriguing historical example of observed phenomena that exceeded contemporary scientific explanation. Whether such cases represent misinterpretation, deception, or genuine biological anomalies remains open to debate. What is certain is that they remind us of the ever-expanding boundaries of our understanding of human physiological potential. And what of Eliza herself? The historical record tells us little about her inner life, her thoughts, her experiences, living with an ability that made her simultaneously valuable as a spectacle and threatening to established understanding. The fragmentary evidence suggests a woman who sought first to capitalize on her difference, then ultimately to escape it." Her letter to Dr. Wells, "There are aspects of nature that perhaps are not meant to be dissected and classified," hints at a philosophical resignation, a recognition that her unique ability placed her outside the framework of conventional understanding. Her subsequent life in Oakland, devoted to charitable work and artistic expression, suggests she found a way to integrate her uniqueness into a life that no longer required her to be a spectacle. In her final years, according to local church records, Eliza was known for visiting the sick, particularly those with unusual or disfiguring conditions. A notation in the Lakeside Presbyterian Church Bulletin from 1920 mentions her special ministry to those afflicted with unusual conditions, bringing comfort through her gentle presence and understanding. One might speculate that her own experience of physiological uniqueness gave her particular empathy for others who existed outside normal parameters. The Oakland Tribune's mention of her textile arts, unique patterns and textures that won recognition, suggests she may have found a socially acceptable outlet for her unusual abilities. The textile pieces, like the woman who created them, have vanished without trace, leaving us to wonder what unique textures might have meant in the context of a woman who could apparently alter the very nature of her tissues. After her death in 1923, no further mentions of her unusual abilities appear in any records. William Donovan's obituary in 1919 described him simply as a dedicated railroad man and devoted husband, with no hint that his wife possessed extraordinary capabilities. It seems that, in the end, Eliza achieved what many with unusual conditions desire, to be remembered not for their differences, but for their common humanity. The files remain open, the questions unanswered. And perhaps, as Eliza herself suggested in her letter to Dr. Wells, some aspects of nature are not meant to be dissected and classified. Sometimes the confirmation that something exists beyond our understanding must be enough. In the words that concluded Dr. Holloway's original article, the case of Eliza Corbin stands as a reminder that the boundary between the known and the unknown is not fixed, but permeable, and that even in an age of scientific certainty, mysteries persist that challenge our fundamental assumptions about human potential. And as for those original documents, damaged by water and time, they sit in climate-controlled storage, the ink fading, the paper gradually surrendering to entropy. The mystery they contain continues to wait, neither solved nor forgotten, but suspended in that liminal space between history and legend, science and wonder, a quiet reminder that the world remains in some fundamental way unknowable. Today, over a century since Eliza Corbin demonstrated her inexplicable ability in a small circus tent in New Haven, we possess technologies and understanding that Dr. Wells could not have imagined. We can map the human genome, visualize the brain in action, manipulate individual cells. Yet we still encounter phenomena that resist explanation, individuals whose capabilities seem to exceed established parameters. Perhaps someday someone will appear with abilities similar to Eliza's in an age equipped to study and understand them. Until then, her case remains what Dr. Holloway called it, an enigma, a question without an answer, a reminder of the limits of certainty. In that sense, the true significance of Eliza Corbin may not be what she could do, but what her story tells us about the nature of knowledge itself. All was incomplete, all was evolving, all was leaving space for wonder. As Dr. Wells wrote in his final journal entry concerning Eliza, I have come to accept that complete understanding may lie beyond our reach. Perhaps this acceptance, rather than frustrated pursuit, represents the more mature scientific position. And so we leave Eliza Corbin, or Elizabeth Marsh, or Mrs. William Donovan, in her quiet grave in Oakland, her secrets intact, her mystery unresolved. The woman who could change the very nature of her flesh has become part of medical folklore, a footnote in the history of scientific anomalies, a whisper that occasionally resurfaces when researchers encounter phenomena that defy explanation. Her story reminds us that between the known and the unknown lies a borderland where observation and explanation have yet to reconcile, where what we see challenges what we believe possible. It is in this borderland that science advances, not by dismissing the inexplicable, but by expanding the boundaries of explanation to encompass it. As we close this account, perhaps it's fitting to return to Eliza's own words, the only ones we have directly from her. What you observed is real. I am neither charlatan nor illusion. However, there are aspects of nature that perhaps are not meant to be dissected and classified. In that simple statement lies a profound truth, that nature always exceeds our categories, that the map is never the territory, that mystery is not merely the absence of knowledge, but sometimes its most essential quality.